Can we start with a question that was originally posed to Ruth Valerio from John? And the question is, there's understandably a lot of fear and lament in the world for those who care about climate change. Do you have hope? And if so, why? So that was a question that was originally put in the chat to Ruth, but I think it would be great to hear from both Ruth and Hannah what you think about that. So first of all, Ruth, do you have hope?
Thank you. And it's such an important question, and my answer to that has been changing over the years. And I used to talk about hope a lot, and I did, Hope for the Planet Earth and various tours and so on, talking about hope, and was involved in putting on a conference with Richard Borkham and other speakers where we looked at the concept of hope. And as I know Hannah has been involved with thinking about so much over the last few years, as the absolute reality of where we have got to has increasingly hit, I know that I have shifted away from speaking about hope to I fear a danger in jumping too quickly to hope. I don't want to lose hope, but I fear a danger of jumping too quickly to hope, and that we need to have that stage of lament and grief as a part of that. I think the language of hope for me came in sort of the decades ago, when the kind of things that we're thinking about, the kind of things that we're seeing now, were very much predictions. And it was, we have hope. If we take this action, if we change, we can avert this. And then over the last few years, have come to that horrendous realization that what for years was predictions is now reality. And I've shifted in my thinking when this is now not talking about the likelihood of a climate emergency, it's recognizing that we're living in a climate emergency. So how do we respond to that? And the grief and the lament, for me personally, is so much a part of that, as I realize that we haven't made those changes. And yet, we do still need, thank you, Daniel. Yeah, we do still need that discipline of hope. And our action does come from a place of hope as followers of Jesus, of the Lord of all creation. We've, in the conference that I was involved with putting on some years ago, Richard Borkham talked about ultimate hope and proximate hope. So ultimate hope is that ultimate hope that we have in Jesus. Proximate hope is what we look forward to now, and it's that proximate hope that is diminishing. And then Margot Hodson came in and added a third around resilient hope. And that's the hope that we live with, sort of between the fading hope of proximate hope, if I'm saying hope too often, and then the living in that tension with then looking forward to the ultimate hope. And we do that in confidence, but also in humility, as we see what a mess we've made. But then also, certainly my work at Tear Fund shows me that the terrible situations, but also shows me the wonderful things that people are doing, coming from individuals, from businesses, from communities. If you've been watching the Earthshot programs, you'll have seen some of the hope that's come through there. So the proximate hope hasn't entirely gone, but I do know that my language and my own personal feelings around that have changed, probably in the last 5 years or so. And I'll pause because I know Hannah has lots to share about this as well.
Hannah.
Thanks. I'm going to reiterate and maybe slightly just reframe some of what Ruth has said, because I really agree with what she said. When we talk about hope, we have to ask ourselves what we mean by Christian hope. And what we mean by Christian hope is our hope in the salvation of the world. It's not in I guess we don't hope in the powers of this world more than we hope in the Lord and what we are promised. The other part of Christian hope that helps to make sense of that reality now is that hope in the Christian tradition isn't just a feeling, though we do talk about it in that way as well. It's also a virtue, like love. And when we speak about love as a virtue, we refer to love as action that we take in the world. It's a kind of commitment. It's a way of being that isn't solely driven by how we feel on a certain day. And in the same way, we can treat hope as a virtue, by which it's virtuous to live in hopeful ways. So we can behave in hopeful ways, regardless of whether we feel hopeful. So I quite often get asked whether or not what makes me feel hopeful. And I think there's a real danger in insisting that people scout around in the world around them for things that might give them short-term hopeful feelings, because we're so often disappointed by the decisions made by governments, by corporations, by institutions when it comes to climate change, that it can be very dangerous for your kind of emotional resilience and well-being if you're constantly sort of ping-ponging between hopeful feeling, a rush of emotional energy that's then met with despair, disappointment, collapse. And if we're relying on those good news stories to give us motivation to continue choosing hopeful action, then we'll quickly burn out. So instead, I like to talk about what it means to choose hopefulness in the ways that we live. And the reason that that's important, that differentiation in language, is that I think if we rely on feelings for behaving hopefully in the world, then it's very easy to end up in despair. And it's very difficult to behave wisely, to behave in ways which might move us towards hopeful behavior when we feel despairing. Because when we despair, we assume that we know what the future is and that nothing can be done. So the flip side to a virtue of hope is a kind of sin of despair. And just like we don't rely on hopeful feelings, we also shouldn't put too much stake on despairing feelings for driving our behavior. So when we lean into despairing feelings or allow them to dominate the way we relate to the world, then we're basically fearing the powers of this world more than we fear the Lord. And if the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, then we can't act wisely unless we're choosing a kind of a virtue of hope over the sin of despair. So I'd say this question of, do you have hope? I do, in that it's a practice that I try and embody. And one of the things about trying to embody that practice is that often you find other people join you. And then you can encourage other people to behave in hopeful ways as well. And that becomes a reflection of the kind of transformative work of the Spirit, which is where our Christian hope rests. So that's a kind of slightly meandering answer, but hopefully this mirroring of the virtue of hope and the sin of despair is a more helpful model than relying on the movement of our feelings.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Ruth, for your insight on that very important question. I'm now going to pass over to Neville to ask the next question, which is another question that we felt we wanted to ask both of you. So, Neville.
Yeah, so there's a couple of questions here that may not necessarily seem to be so obviously linked to climate justice, but just a couple of that came through which have some connections. One was species extinctions have occurred throughout evolution. And so if we recognize that, then the questioner asks, is it realistic to expect no species extinctions? And then if not, the tricky bit is, what is the degree of aim for if no extinction is considered to be unrealistic within a given timescale? And then relating to this, a question of, in thinking about God's love for and desire to preserve all creation, or should we identify all creation as the earth as it has been for the last few thousand years, which is convenient for human civilization, as the questioner puts it, Or if we recognize that the earth has gone through many changes with species coming and going, why would God be particularly concerned about preserving the earth as it is for us just now? So do we have a rather anthropocentric view, perhaps?
Thank you. Oh, go on, Hannah. Do you want to?
Sure, I'm happy to give a couple of thoughts on this. I think the main differentiation that we live with when we ask this question is that we know pretty confidently that these species extinctions are the product of human sin. And so while there is a much wider theological question that we could ask about, basically a theodicy question, right? So the question underneath this question is sort of, are you saying that God cares more about these creatures than the other creatures that have gone extinct? And the background question to that is, why would a loving God allow extinctions over millions of years? Why do you think these ones matter particularly? That's a wider theodicy question. I'm not going to try and give an answer to that because I don't have a particular answer to it. And I think, there's plenty of different arguments people have given, but it's not necessarily my interest. I think the differentiation I make between that question and the question at stake here is the role of human sin. So when we're thinking about human behavior and its effect on the world, our primary response is, are we behaving in ways which reflect obedience to God as creatures who have a particular gifting or vocation, which means that we have power over other creatures? Has that power been administered wisely? What have been the consequences of greed, of violence administered by humans? So that makes it a very different question. It's not that we're living through a somewhat arbitrary extinction event, although we might say that, oh, well, we'd like to try and maintain our relationships with certain creatures because we feel affection for them. And I don't see anything in particular wrong with that. But the question that's at the heart of this is really, how are we responding to the sin of humans and trying to pursue holiness in the world? And in some ways, it's not for us to question what hypothetical extinction may or may not have happened had humans not behaved so egregiously sinfully over the last few hundred years. The reality is that they have. And so that's the relationship that we're responsible for restoring. I know that the phrase is one that Ruth used rather than me, but if I was referring to God's love for all creation, I would be talking about God's restoration of all creation. I would be referring to an eschatological restoration. My new heavens and new earth is as abundantly full of all of the creatures that have existed over billions of years as can conceivably be imagined. But I'm a big fan of Irenaeus, so that's my theological influence. But the specific thing, what are we doing in relation to extinction event now? For me, that's a question of human sin, and that's why it matters.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go with that first question too. I don't have an answer to extinction in general through the millennia, but the issue for today is the extinction that we're experiencing on an unprecedented rate because of our human behavior. And I think that's what we need to focus on. And with preserving, similar to what Hannah said, if I talked about God preserving creation, then I apologize in my talk. That's one of the dangers of having to do something pre-recorded in the midst of a whole load of meetings that you're in all the way through the day. We are called to preserve, to till, to tend, to take care of, whichever English word you want to use to translate the Hebrew there. I don't think God is in the business of preserving as such. I think God is in the business of drawing towards, through God's Holy Spirit, and working towards perfection and reconciliation and restoration. So I don't think it's about God preserving the earth as it is just now. We are moving towards the recreated and the renewed and transformed heavens and earth. And our role is to be taking care of the world in this moment that we are living in, and to be living in ways that don't damage it further, but ultimately God's love for is about leading it towards its final consummation, its final end.
Thank you. That's very helpful, and hopefully that's helpful for the questioner as well. And I guess it probably, as you both probably indicated, it's difficult to put a number on these kinds of things anyway. I mean, if you're going to ask how much extinction is tolerable or how much sin is tolerable, I think we'd probably all give the answer as little as possible. So
I'm going to ask another question now that was put in the chat earlier from Martin, and it was put in as a question for Hannah, but again, I think both of you might be interested in replying. So the question is consumption a sin? We cannot live without consuming. Adam, before the fall, was consuming, but was without sin. So do you have any comments on that?
Yes, it's a really good question. Thank you for picking out that word from my talk. Yes, I would say that obviously at its most basic level, consumption is a description of what it means to be essentially biologically alive, that we consume to survive, like all other creatures. So we share this in common with all other living creatures. And in that sense, it's part of the ways that we've been made to live, where we live interdependently in that we are reliant on other creatures to live, and that involves consumption. So in of itself, consumption isn't a sin. I think the ways that I was trying to use it in the talk, which probably could have been like slightly better nuanced, is that consumption, because in some ways is the most natural of behaviors for creatures, is also one that it's very easy to become consumed by. One of the things that I think is a useful differentiation for thinking about, what one of the responsibilities we have as humans, as consuming creatures who also have a considerable amount of power, much greater power than most other animals that have lived on the earth through its history, is, and we have awareness of that power and its impact, means that we also have a kind of responsibility to control what we consume. So consumption, when it moves away from need or sufficiency into accumulation for personal, we move very quickly from personal safety into personal comfort, and then from personal comfort into greed. So it's a sliding scale. Although it would be fun to trigger this debate, I'm not going to name a place where the sliding scale moves into greed from the sort of creaturely desire for safety and comfort. But that's essentially what we're talking about. And as our power has increased, and our ability to consume more has increased, our ability to manage our own behavior does not seem to have developed with it. We seem to be trapped, consuming ourselves by cycles of accumulation. So this is really, what Jesus is getting at in the parable of the barns. This is the fundamental thing that Jesus is talking about. It's interesting. I don't know if any of you have noticed this, but the parable of the barns and the man who dies suddenly, having accumulated all this wealth, sits right next to Jesus's command to look to the birds of the air and the flowers of the field, to look at the ways that they non-anxiously depend on their Father in heaven for what they need. And then is followed by this story about a man who does not non-anxiously depend on his Father in heaven, but accumulates much more wealth than he can possibly ever get through. And so this is where our particular power as creatures has gone far beyond that of a sort of a natural or good desire to have safety, to have comfort. So that would be a sort of a differentiation point that I was trying to make.
And I think to add to that, absolutely, we are created to consume. So consumerism in and of itself is not a sin. And in fact, our central act as followers of Jesus is an act of consumption, of consumerism. So there is that right at the center of it. I think for me, where it flips over is where we're consuming at the expense of others, and including the wider natural world. So it's that balance of that is the tension between loving the world too much, which is that hyper consumerism, but then not loving the world enough, which is a world denying, not walking away from our consumer culture. And it's holding that tension there. So it's so what I'm wanting to say is that so I think it's more than only the flip between need and want, because I think there's something about this world being very good and us having a good, generous God who wants to give us the things and bless us with things. So it's the need is central, but it goes further than that as well, because we have this wonderful, abundant God. In one sense, we don't need this amazing world. We could just have a boring, bland world, and we could have been created to exist on grey wafers that hang from a tree, whereas God has given us this amazing diversity of food and vibrancy and colour and, far more, all these wonderful things. But it causes problems because we then consume at a level that happens at the expense of others and the wider natural world. And I think, and so it's moving from consumerism to hyper consumerism. I can remember one of my daughters when they came back from from the first childhood party that they had gone to on their own without my supervision. And she got dropped off by a friend, walked through the front door and promptly threw up everywhere. Why? Because she'd consumed too much chocolate. Now, a little bit of chocolate was okay, and she was used to that, but left to her own devices, she'd gone mad and she'd consumed way more chocolate, and then it was too much for her and vomited it up. And I sometimes think we're like that with our hyper consumerism. It's causing so many problems, and we're vomiting up all of the waste and all of the things that we can't control through the consumerism that we're a part of. There was a BBC clip recently, I don't know if anyone saw it, about clothes in Ghana and the second-hand clothes market in Ghana. I'm talking for too long, so I won't go into the details, but I watched it and just thought, we just have too many clothes in the system. We're buying too many clothes. It's okay to buy some, but we are buying too many. So it's that hyper consumerism where it comes at the expense of others and the wider natural world that is that problem that we flip over into.
Thank you. Neville, would you like to introduce to us the next question? Thanks.
Yeah, so a couple that seem to be related here. The first one, the person says, I really agree with Hannah that acceptance and response to climate change requires a whole worldview shift, along with a more solid theological underpinning. Could Hannah say more about what is involved in this worldview change? So maybe just let you respond to that one, and then we'll come to a related question after.
That's a great question. It's a very big question. So I'm going to pick maybe one thing to think about in relation to this. I think there's lots of things that are involved in changing someone's worldview. But perhaps a starting point, if we reflect on some of the sort of key marker points that I indicated in my talk for recent cultural shift in the conversation about climate change, as a basis, as a background for thinking about this change within the church. One thing that we can observe is that essentially the things that we speak about together constantly make and remake our attention. And as our attentions are changed, because we are redirected to look at things that might have previously gone unnoticed to us because they were unnamed, or we didn't have a way of seeing them, then the ways we see the world change as well. So one of the things it's important to remember when we think about changing people's worldviews is that people's worldviews are plastic because our attentions are plastic. We're constantly learning from speech around us, from our communities, from the kind of language that we hear, what kinds of things in the world are worthy of our attention and what kinds of things aren't. So to give one very tiny example of this, there has been recent significant decline in the UK amongst, in terms of people's knowledge of names for creatures apart from humans. So for native species in the UK. There was in 2013, I think it was, the Oxford Junior Dictionary cut dozens of words that were to do with the natural world from their junior dictionary and replaced them with technology words because they said they didn't reflect the language that children used anymore. Now, that's a philosophy that assumes that the language we use only reflects existing worldview rather than being something which is constantly shaping the kind of worldview that we have. So the things that we speak about together, the things that we are told to pay attention to because they're named, perhaps they're named in the prayers in our churches, perhaps they're named in the kinds of education we give children, perhaps they're named in the activities that we do with groups of other Christians. All of these things are our attention shaping. And if our attention is shifted towards those things which have gone unnoticed or unheard, the marginal, the vulnerable, those things which are at risk of being destroyed, those voices globally who have gone unheard, there is change in people's perceptions and attention. We've seen that very clearly in UK consciousness around climate change over the last few years. And I think the BBC's shift in its policy around climate reporting has a huge amount to do with that. The kinds of conversations that are heard have changed. I think similarly, if you teach children the names of creatures, they then see those creatures more. They know to recognize them, they build relationships with them. So as a first very basic stage, the language we use matters. And of course, we see this theologically as well in our prayer life. So one of the things, I believe that prayer works in the sense that God also works through prayer, but I also believe that prayer works in the ways that it shapes our attentiveness. So the things that we pray for together teach us what matters to divine compassion. And so, that can be both a cultural shift in the language we use and the things that we deem worthy of speech. And also it can be something that we see in our churches. What do we speak about as being of concern to God? What do we bring before our Father in prayer? So that would be a very basic first step of worldview change, that attention is plastic and it can be shifted.
Ruth, I'll hand over to you if you want to add anything further.
No, that was great. I don't have anything I need to add. Thanks, Hannah.
And then the other question was, if we welcome the change in Christian attitudes to climate change, but is this welcome change primarily motivated, do we think, by belief or theology, or by a more general sense of general social duty and or fear?
Very briefly, I think it's both and. And my general approach to this is that whether people are here because of social duty or fear or because of a transformed heart, I think they don't necessarily not go together. And the focus that we must have is helping people to understand why the fear they're experiencing represents a much deeper theological need. A much deeper theological reframing of our relationship with the world. So that would be my brief answer, that it's both and.
Yeah, and we are so much a part of our society, aren't we? The church isn't this little enclave that sits and those of us who are Christians sit in a different realm to everybody else. We're so much a part of society, so inevitably the narratives and the things that are shaping society are going to impact us too. I mean, we can see that in so many different areas, and you can see that down through history. And this is why I think John Stott was so helpful in that constant encouragement to be keeping the newspaper in his day in one hand and the Bible in the other, because it's not the case that we're isolated Christians. Our Bibles are always going to be interacting with the societal narratives, and one of the roles of being a follower of Jesus is to respond to the particular challenges of the day as his follower, and our challenges will be different to the challenges from generations back and in the future. So it's inevitable that it's going to come from both places. I suspect it comes from society more, as that narrative has increased societally over the last few years. It's not a surprise that we're now seeing the church responding to it. I'd like to think it's all down to the work of those of us, including Hannah's grandfather, of course, who've been working for so many decades. I suspect it's not got anything to do with us at all. But as Hannah said, we welcome that, and then we help those who are responding then to see where there are the scriptural foundations there as well, and where this isn't just a secular agenda that we're jumping onto, but that it comes from the heart of our Christian faith.
It's almost as though the Holy Spirit is not confined by the work of the church. It's almost as though the Spirit is at work in the world.
And he has been active a lot long before the church anyway, so we shouldn't be too surprised at that. I'll hand over to Rhoda for the next couple of questions.
Thank you. So I'm afraid we're running near the end of our time of questions, so this might be the last one. And it's a coupled question to both of you. So part of it comes from Chris Southgate's question about what is it that we as Christians can distinctively contribute to how non-Christians are approaching the climate crisis. And secondly, what can we as scientists distinctively contribute to the response to the climate crisis, in particular, those of us who are both Christians and scientists? So we would love your top tips on those. Maybe Ruth first.
I think there's a whole number of things that we can offer that come from our theology. Just some ones that come to mind immediately. That the hope question that we were exploring before, I think we have got that hope to offer, because as Hannah was saying, it's not just pinned on different things that we see, but it is that ultimate hope rather than the proximate hope. So I do think we have that to offer. I think linked to that, our eschatological understanding leads to us recognizing that we're in this for the long haul. So we're not expecting instant transformation and instant results. And part of being a Christian is learning that ever so frustrating challenge of living in the tension between seeing that now and longing for the not yet. And so we are used to being patient as Christians, as well as desperately wanting to see change now. And so building in that patience, I think, is helpful. Of a sober assessment of the human condition, aka sin. So that recognition, it's not a surprise when we mess up. It's not a surprise when climate talks don't deliver what we're expecting them to. It's not a surprise when we make the wrong choices, because we know that as well as being amazing people, we're also sinful people. So a bit of that kind of gritty realism and the determination to keep going, and undergirding that, the spiritual practices, which I know are other faiths have to offer as well, and actually that's quite a strong part of the environmental movement more widely. But the spiritual practices that give us that tenacity and give us the rhythm to keep going. So I'll just throw those out for more for now and pause at that.
Thank you, Hannah.
I'm not sure I have a huge amount else to add. I was just reflecting on this question and saw that someone else in the chat had put a question around climate skeptics as well, and responding to that. And that almost feels like an appropriate thing to tie into the question about scientists responding to this in the church or in their wider communities. And I think the thing I want to come back to is the Christian value on truth, of truthfulness as being a kind of one of the highest commands that we are given. It's one of the 10 commandments that we have in the Old Testament. Satan is described as the father of lies. We say as Christians that we are trying to pursue the way, the truth, and the life, and being defenders of truth about the nature of the world as best we understand it, that God has given us and God has made, is, I think, a vital Christian vocation. And so I would say that a kind of a willingness to keep speaking truth when it does not want to be heard is one of the key spiritual disciplines of those who work in the sciences and consider themselves Christians. So I think that's in some ways something that we also, share with other faith traditions. And so we could talk about it as something that Christianity doesn't specifically offer to the conversation. But I think in the ways we talk to churches about why it's vital that we speak about climate change, why we respond to climate change, is that it's a kind of response to truth. It's a response to truth about the world. It's a response to truth about the nature of human sin and the destructiveness that it causes. And one of the things that we're trying to prevent people from falling into is a kind of self-deception about themselves, about the world around them. And we live in an era where truth is a debatable point rather than something which is universally pursued. And so I would say that an appeal to truth as a Christian vocation, that is a particular kind of discipline of the sciences, this pursuit of truth about the world and the desire for people to know it better, would be where I would go. And I also think that that's a vital lens for helping our church communities to think through what it means to take climate change seriously as well.